actually, a little while now, and often I've encountered Kusaladevi at Adasthana on young persons retreats, which used to happen maybe 2 or 3 times a year in person. And I'd probably been going along to almost all of them for about 4 or 5 years. And what immediately strikes me about Kusaladevi is her energy. She's got this sort of vitality and sort of free-flowing energy. And it manifests particularly in two ways. I've seen in terms of friendship and in terms of service, and they're connected. So I noticed yesterday when I was listening to Sadhanandi, sometimes I was looking at Sadhanandi talk, and sometimes I looked back to the screen, and I could particularly see actually Kusaladevi and also Lizzie kind of nodding along. They both really love Sadhanandi. I'm sure others do too. And Sadhanandi ordained Kusaladevi and gave Kusaladevi her name. And I could just really see Kusaladevi's energy and vitality in response to Sadhanandi speaking. A lovely kind of warm, open, I could sort of see Kusaladevi sort of geeing up a little bit. Yeah, it's really kind of good. And then what Kusaladevi does is then, sort of gets G'd up by Sadhanandi, her friend or teacher or preceptor. And then also Kusaladevi, she's friends with quite a lot of particularly young women spread across the nation and the continent. So I'm in a few meetings with Kusaladevi, and she often just mentions people's names or talks collectively about young women's experience, particularly in training to join the order. So I love that Kusaladevi has friends that she really looks up to and gets energy and vitality from, and then Kusaladevi just then passes it on to other people. And Kusaladevi is also the chair, quite recently has become the chair at the Nottingham Buddhist Centre. Before that, worked at Karanar for many years, and also does some work with the Buddhist Centre Online. So that's already quite a long list of things that Kusaladevi does: friendship, service, and this sort of vitality. So over to you, Kusaladevi.
Great. Thank you, Shantakara, for a lovely introduction. Let's start my timer. So, yeah, I've been asked to talk about superficiality and moving towards commitment. So I'm just going to dive straight in because 15 minutes isn't very long in a talk. So the word superficiality, I was just thinking, I think that word can sometimes be overused. I think we have particular connotations about what that word means. And I think what we often think that word means is that it's someone who's purposely false, not very genuine. And we often think, oh, I'm not like that. That's not me. I'm not superficial. But that person that I know, they're superficial. So I just sort of want to challenge that view really and say, actually, we all have the potential for superficiality. And that's because we're unintegrated. We're sort of split. We have different aspects of ourselves. So a definition of superficiality, this is the definition that Sangharakshita gives in the talk. Superficiality means of, relating to, being near, or forming the surface. So superficiality is related to the word surface. So it's also what we present outwardly rather than what is genuine. And interestingly, Sangharakshita talks about it as a lack of thoroughness or a lack of care. And of course, if something is on the surface, then that probably means we're not relating from the deepest parts of ourselves. Yeah, so as I was saying, we all have different parts that sort of move in different directions. So we have different drives, different impulses. Sadhanandi was speaking a bit about this yesterday. We have impulses for particular things. And when I was thinking about this idea of doing something just from the surface and not from deeper parts of myself, I was thinking about what Sadhanandi mentioned yesterday around in communication. So when we communicate with other people, we might often, or I'll speak for myself, but I'm often might be just saying what I think other people want to hear, or even acting out of a fear of being disliked. And that means that I'm not bringing all the parts of myself on board and how I really feel about something. And it also probably means that I'm not in touch with what's really most important to me. So I think we can be blown about by these sort of surface concerns, what others think about us, how well we come across. And in a way, we're not sort of totally present, maybe because we're sort of distracted by something else. So we're not totally fully present with people. We've got too many things on our mind to really sort of go deeply with who or what is in front of us. And Sangha actually speaks about that in this area, we might either be acting from our rational mind, but not taking our emotions on board. That's an example of this. So he says we might be thinking, we think we know what's right for us, but actually we've not listened to our emotions. We've not brought our emotions on board. So we have this sort of rational sense of, this is what I should do, but we're not sort of taking the full sense of how our emotional body might respond to that on board. Or the other way that we might do this is that we act out of those emotions very strongly, but we're not very rational. So, for example, we might get carried away by rage, the sort of that idea of like the red mist, where we don't see anything else. Our emotions are just very strong. We haven't really thought through if something's a good idea or not. So I was thinking about when I first met the Dharma, when I first met Buddhism, I was very inspired, enthusiastic, had a lot of energy to practice. As I started to go on, I started to hit deeper parts of my experience, these parts that didn't want to meditate, didn't want to study or do ritual. Sometimes actually, when I was honest with myself, didn't want to be kind with people. So I think we can lose inspiration sometimes and not enjoy practice as much, or even things just get a bit more difficult. And that sometimes can mean that we get to the point where we end up staying involved, say, in the Sangha, because we really like the people. But when it comes to practice, we're just sort of going through the motions. So that's another way that this particular feta can be described. Rites and rituals as ends in themselves. So that means, in a way, doing things just for the sake of it and not as a means to an ideal. So we're not really doing things with the whole of ourselves. And that means we can't really change. So an example, this sort of links a bit to what Pranya Hridaya was saying as well. An example might be being a good Buddhist. So only part of us is actually on board. So thinking about the number of times where I've been at Adhisthana in that shrine room and sat, for example, chanting the refuges and precepts. And am I really present chanting them? No, usually I'm like thinking about what I want for breakfast, or I'm thinking about who I might meet up with that day. So it's like part of me is there, but actually not the whole of me. And actually, it's really, really painful when we don't do things wholeheartedly with the whole of ourselves. When we do something with the whole of our being, there's an engagement, a vibrancy, and aliveness in our experience. And if we're not wholehearted, we can miss opportunities. So Kshantikara mentioned I used to work for Karana. So what I did, one of my roles there was door knocking, raising money as a spiritual practice for Dalit communities in India. And obviously, when you're asking people for money, you feel really nervous. You're caught up in your own sort of mental states around all of that. But what I found again and again is if I wasn't wholehearted and I wasn't present with people on the doors, then it'd be very painful and I'd miss a lot of opportunities. I remember a particular one where I knocked and this man answered. He was very distracted, so he wasn't able to be present. He had a lot going on. And I was so caught up with my own experience and my own fear and what had happened at the last door and who might I meet at the next doors, that I just totally missed his energy and I missed a chance to empathize with him. And this man told me that his son had just gone into hospital. And at the time, because I wasn't present, I just couldn't meet him. I was over concerned with what was going on for me. And I missed that opportunity to be kind and empathize. And I came away and I felt so sad and so disappointed, and I just totally saw that I'd missed an opportunity. And I think if I had connected with my intention before knocking that door and committed, if I'd committed to being fully present with this person, then I would have been able to just really meet him much more fully. And that would have been much more satisfactory for both of us. So yeah, if we do things without committing, only part of us is there. We live in an age of distraction, don't we? There's so much to choose from, so much input, and it's easy to do lots of things without any depth. So, you know, multitasking is kind of very common, isn't it? Like, yeah, this idea of like doing lots of things at once. But if we do that, are we actually doing anything with the fullness of our being? There's a lot of pleasure in being fully present. And as I said, including in relation to others. And that allows for a deeper connection. If we're more deeply in contact with ourselves, we can be in more deeper contact with others. And also this leads to change. We're affected by one another, but also our behavior affects others. And if we can commit and sort of allow ourselves to be changed by others, then that's how we'll sort of move on the path. So just perhaps a question, what would we choose to do with the fullness of our whole being if we could? So I'm going to share a little story from the Buddha's life. Well, it's not a whole story that I'm going to share, but it's just very briefly. Many, many people, when they met the Buddha, were just so moved by his presence, but also by his teaching. So there were a group called the Kalamas, and I'm just going to read a quote from what they said when they heard the Buddha's teaching. Magnificent Lord, magnificent, just as if he were to place upright what was overturned, to reveal what was hidden, to show the way to one who was lost, or to carry a lamp into the dark, so that those with eyes could see forms. In the same way has the Blessed One, through many lines of reasoning, made the Dharma clear. We go to the Blessed One for refuge, and to the Dharma and the Sangha. So when people met the Buddha and heard his teaching and met his presence, they immediately, if they were receptive and ready, they would want to commit, they would want to devote their energies to the ideal, devote their energies to the Buddha, to the path of practice, the Dharma, and to the spiritual friendship and community, the Sangha. And we call this going for refuge to the three jewels. And that this going for refuge is commitment. So when we're deeply affected or stirred, we can have this moment of sort of spiritual rebirth. And that's when commitment can arise within us. But also practicing commitment can help us on the path to being a true individual, or to being sort of free, as it were. And I was thinking, in a way, it might seem a bit converse that commitment will lead to freedom. So we sometimes think of commitment as being binding or restrictive. But actually, we're talking about total freedom, total liberation of heart, and total liberation of mind. And for that, something needs to radically transform within us. And for that, we need to engage the whole of our being, including our depths. And to do that, we need to commit. So commitment, what is it we're committed to? That's a question you can ask yourself and just see what arises. And what do we want to be committed to? What do we really want in our lives, and why? All of us here will have glimpsed vision and inspiration to be here. So we'll have had, even if it's only a taste of a taste of a taste of a taste of freedom. How can we stay in touch with that? How can we stay in touch with that vision and inspiration? Because parts of us resist change. So without commitment, we're unlikely to really see this path through. We have to get enough of ourselves on board. Then if we get enough of ourselves on board, we can really have an effect. If the depths are on board, we can start to change, start to transform ourselves. So a little bit about what helps us become committed. So the first thing is ritual, I think. I find ritual very mysterious, and often ritual brings on board my emotions that I didn't even know needed to be brought on board. So Kshantikara mentioned that I'd recently become chair at the Buddhist Centre in Nottingham. That was back in October. And I had a ritual for that in January. And I knew that when I took on this role, there were certain parts of me that were going to have to change and transform. And they were around habits, around my work and how I approach work. But, you know, I started the role and I just got stuck in, and those sort of habits, I just sort of got a bit carried away really by those habits. But then I had this ritual to become chair in front of the whole Sangha. And suddenly, for the next few weeks, it felt like everything was sort of turned upside down. Suddenly, these parts of me that needed integrating and bringing on board just wouldn't go away. So it was like, because I'd made that commitment, I had to then look at what that meant to bring the whole of myself on board with that. So yeah, resistance can sometimes arise in response to ritual or commitment. And we have to be patient and kind with ourselves around that. Personally, I know now that ritual and commitment will probably have a kickback at some point, but that's okay. So I know that that's just because parts of me want to stay with the familiar. So Sadnandi was talking last night about the fish basket. Parts of me want to hang on and keep my head in the fish basket. But I trust actually that the flower seller's basket and the flower seller's market is more beautiful. So public rituals also mean that we're held accountable. For myself, I don't want to let others down, and that motivates me actually. That really helps if others witness me. Kshantikara invited us to make offerings yesterday. So offerings can be a commitment. Yeah, just sort of, in a way, we can just sort of try it and see what arises, see what the effect is. And we might be surprised. Sometimes our emotions are much more mysterious than we know. Okay, I'm going to rattle through a bit. So some more things that we could practice. A commitment to the truth. So let's not confuse Buddhism with niceness. If something's not true, let's commit to the truth. So we sometimes think of Buddhists, don't we, as nice, kind, patient, and gentle. So yes, there are some good qualities there, but we can't pretend. We don't always feel like that, and that's fine. So how can we be in touch with our actual deeper experience and do that without harming others? I think there's sometimes a bit of a tension there. Or without putting forward a particular superficial response that we think of as Buddhism. And sometimes we have to take a risk in communication and be willing to apologize if we get things wrong. I think what else can help us commit is just by setting intentions. So when we sit to meditate, just part of that can be setting up well, deciding or committing to a particular practice. Otherwise, we might just spend the whole meditation on the surface and not able to go much deeper with our experience. We can commit to taking on personal precepts. So being generous, writing, I'm going to write to 2 of my friends every week. I'm going to write cards to 2 of my friends and rejoice in their lovely qualities. Or every time I go to a friend's house, I'm always going to take something. I'm never going to show up empty-handed. Or whenever I speak to a friend about someone else, I'm going to commit to only saying what that person would be happy to hear if they were also in the room. So yeah, Kshantikara also mentioned about committing to a retreat. So we can do that this weekend. For example, just turning up to things, just showing up, but also intentions like turning off our phone, really allowing ourselves to be here fully, to be very present and see what happens. And most importantly, I think we need to commit from the best and highest part of ourselves. and we need to commit to something that we think of as beautiful and true. So we'll always be unintegrated until we're enlightened, and we need to notice all of those different parts, not force them in a particular direction and not ignore them, but commitment can actually help all of those parts come on board and becoming more integrated. And I think the way to do that, so I was thinking about how do we commit without being willful and shutting off or blocking parts of ourselves? And I think it's to do with the heart. So I think it's to do with receptivity, connection to what our deepest values and wishes are, and connection to our heart wish, which I'm sure for all of us is to be free. So we're not trying to force, but we're just trying to remember that every time we commit and every time we do something. When we meditate, when we study, when we communicate, when we work, when we play. Remember, listen to our heart, listen to what is truly and most important to us. Because we need all of those parts on board if we're going to practice the Dharma and if we're going to transform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kusaladevi. Yeah, thank you very, very much.